Hey, what's up, world history students? This week we're going to take just a little look at the scientific revolution, and the age of enlightenment. Okay, so as we get into the 1500s, the Renaissance has been going on for roughly 200 years. Renaissance is French for rebirth. Europe has been rediscovering the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans, and as they enter the 16th century, they go beyond the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus publishes on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, famous for suggesting that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but that the Earth revolves around the sun. What was powerful about this is that it challenged centuries-old ideas about how the universe worked, and it was about using new methods and evidence in order to make conclusions, no matter how revolutionary these conclusions might be. And this publication is often cited as the beginning of what will be known as the scientific revolution. Many people view the capstone of the scientific revolution to be Newton's publication of Principia in 1687. And this is an incredibly powerful publication. It describes the laws of the universe, and it's a universe in which most things can be explained with simple principles such as mathematics. It's so powerful that it would not be challenged for over 200 years later when Albert Einstein comes on the scene with his theories of relativity. But even today, Newton's laws are taught in first-year physics classes, and you learn it in introductory engineering classes. Considered the crowning achievement of the scientific revolution. So it's needless to say that the scientific revolution gave humanity a new perspective on the universe, and it gave humanity new powers. And we began to challenge all assumptions. And so as we get into the late 1600s and early 1700s, people start to try to use these same tools, the same deductive reasoning, on some of the oldest questions that humanity has ever asked itself. Some of these questions have been the fodder of philosophers and religion for thousands of years, such as why did this happen? How was this related to the Renaissance? Oh, I just wanted to ask these questions. These aren't necessarily really philosophical questions that have been on our minds for thousands of years. These are just kind of questions that I'm just throwing out there. I was thinking about these while I was researching this. Why did this happen at this period? How was the scientific revolution related to the Renaissance? How was it related to things that were happening politically in Europe? So this period of time gave humanity a new perspective. It allowed people to challenge their assumptions. They applied deductive reasoning to some of humanity's most enduring questions. Okay, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment started in the late 17th century, so the late 1600s, and it was a philosophical movement in Europe that was tied to the scientific revolution. Here's a lot of those big questions that have been on our minds for centuries. What rights do we have as human beings? Who gets rights and who does not? And who decides? What duty or obligations do we have towards one another? And what is the role of government? Who has the right to rule? An example of thinking during the Enlightenment is illustrated in a passage from John Locke, who is considered one of the pillars of the Enlightenment. This was published in 1689. It's from the second treatise concerning civil government. John Locke says the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, the law of reason. Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. When his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, preserve the rest of mankind? So, what Locke is saying here is that the power of the mind to think, to reason, is the natural law that should govern human action. We are a thinking people. We use reason. We shouldn't harm anyone else, especially during times where there is no competition. And competition, I guess Locke would probably consider to be like a time when maybe there's only enough food for one of us and there's two of us. That would be competition. But if we're not in competition, we shouldn't be harming one another. We should try to help each other. We should try to preserve mankind. And unless it's for the purpose of justice, we don't have the right to take the life and possessions of others. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, hey, man, that's common sense. Really? Is it common sense for the late 1600s? Early 1700s? Is that seriously common sense? This is a time when kings and queens and emperors ruled over commoners. This is a time when some people were enslaved. So in all honesty, Locke's ideas were far from what we would consider to be common sense. His ideas for their time were very controversial. All right. So it's no surprise that as we come into the late 1700s and the early 1800s, you have a whole string of revolutions that are happening, especially in the Americas. And these are, to a large degree, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, things like life, liberty, health. The United States Declaration of Independence cites these things. The French Revolution cites these things. The various revolutions in Latin America cite all of these things. Now, one of the reasons why the Enlightenment came about when it did, not only did we have new tools of thinking and the opportunity to challenge notions, but it might have been that society now had the responsibility to think a little deeper about these ideas because it was getting more and more power through the scientific revolution. And as these powers were becoming even more significant, when science was applied to the Industrial Revolution, we were living in a society where we could produce more than we had ever produced before. However, the Industrial Revolution had a certain hunger for raw materials and a certain hunger for markets in which to sell your products that had not existed before. It was also a time of powerful weapons and ways to project power and to control a large empire, methods of communication, methods of force. And many historians tie it directly to the age of imperialism, where especially Western European powers sought areas to get raw materials and markets in which they could push their finished products. Places like Africa that were carved up by European powers into all these empires and colonies. So technology keeps accelerating through the Industrial Revolution, and we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution in the coming weeks. But the thing about the technology that keeps growing at an alarming rate is the fact that the philosophical and moral framework does not keep up with it. And so what do we have? We have the 20th century, the 1900s, and early in the 20th century, throughout most of it, it is one of the bloodiest centuries in all of human history. So in the 1800s, we have independence movements in the Americas and in Europe. We see abolishment of slavery in most parts of the world. But we also see the age of imperialism, where more and more control is exerted over people all around the planet. And in the early 1900s, everything comes to a head